Mexico, stuck between the US and China, is planning to take bold steps against China. Bloomberg reports, citing three sources familiar with the matter, that Mexico will impose higher tariffs on Chinese goods such as cars, textiles, and plastic products, with potential effects on other Asian countries as well. The proposal is expected to be submitted to Congress by September 8th. Although the specific tariff rates are not yet clear, given the strong majority held by President Claudia Sheinbaum's governing coalition in both chambers, approval seems almost certain. At the same time, the Trump administration has continued urging Mexico to raise tariffs on Chinese imports in an effort to curb the influx of cheap Chinese goods into the US through Mexico. Upon tracing the origin of the news, it becomes clear that this tariff plan is not a sudden idea, but rather the result of a long-standing trade tensions. Over the past 2 years, the penetration of Chinese goods into Mexico has surpassed that of most other Latin American countries. In February, Mexico's Deputy Minister of the Economy publicly acknowledged that the government had begun imposing tariffs on low-value imported goods. These typically refer to small packages valued below the tax exemption threshold, which had previously entered the country duty-free under the de minimis policy. This shift is due to the large volumes of cross-border e-commerce platforms from China, especially Shein and Temu, which continue to exploit this policy loophole. They have been flooding the Mexican market with cheap clothing, small appliances, and accessories through postal channels, significantly disrupting Mexico's local textile and retail industries. Moreover, China has also been using Mexico as an export hub to funnel goods into the US, further intensifying US concerns over this trade bypass issue. Caught between China and the US, Mexico has been forced to take action. This led to the deputy minister's statement in late February, signaling that Mexico is exploring more stringent regulatory measures, including tightening the de minimis threshold, strengthening declaration audits, and possibly implementing a reference price system. This would prevent even low-priced declared packages from being priced below the minimum threshold set by the government. In addition to exploiting loopholes, counterfeit goods from China have also become a major headache for the Mexican government. On November 29, 2024, the Mexican government launched a large-scale raid at the Mexico Mart in downtown Mexico City. Police, Marines, and Ministry of Economy officials conducted a sweeping search of the 16-story commercial complex. Law enforcement seized about 262,000 items lacking legal import documents or labels, including around 90,000 counterfeit goods bearing fake Marvel, Disney, and other international brand names. According to the Associated Press and El País, most of these confiscated items were imported from China and other Asian countries. Following the operation, Ministry of Economy officials publicly stated that these low-priced counterfeit goods mostly come from China and are severely impacting local industries. The goods not only disrupt market order, but also cause significant damage to local industries, including textiles, toys, and footwear. After the raid, the government announced that it would seize the entire building and destroy the confiscated items while initiating similar operations nationwide. This marked the third raid at the same location within a year. In addition, automobiles are another major export from China to Mexico. According to the China Passenger Car Association, in the first half year, China's car exports to Mexico surged by 31%, reaching over 230,000. This makes Mexico the largest global export destination for Chinese cars, surpassing Russia. But these figures are not favorable for Mexican domestic manufacturers. Chinese electric vehicles face a maximum tariff of only 20% in Mexico, while in the US, former President Biden raised the tariff on Chinese EV for 100% and banned vehicles with Chinese software from entering the market. This stark contrast led Vanessa Ramirez, managing director of the private consulting firm Corporate Planning Economic Analysis, to sharply point out if the tariffs are not high enough to allow local companies to compete freely in the domestic market, they are essentially useless. And this action came too late. The government hasn't sent the right signal to the private sector. In other words, only tariffs high enough to curb the influx of cheap Chinese goods can truly protect local industries. But the Mexican government acted too late, and private enterprises still feel uncertain about the policy hesitating to invest confidently. As a result, external observers believed that based on these cases, it is clear that the Mexican government's goal is to protect local businesses from the impact of Chinese cheap goods, while also addressing the issue of Chinese products bypassing US tariffs through Mexico. The deeper reason behind these events lies primarily in the intersection of geopolitical and economic interest. While ongoing pressure from the US is an external driving force, more crucially, it is China's continued strategy of exploiting trade loopholes that play a key role. Public data shows that cheap Chinese goods have been consistently flowing into the US market via Mexico. This model manifests in three main forms. First is the typical re-export trade, where goods arrive in Mexico and are then re-exported to the US to avoid tariffs labeled as directly from China. In 2024, China's total exports to Mexico reached $90 billion with consumer goods like clothing and mobile phones making up 26.6%. Many of these goods ultimately end up in the US, forming a triangular trade bypass. Second is label laundering, where some companies carry out minimal processing in Mexico, apply a Made in Mexico label, and then export the goods to the US. This is the country of origin laundering method often criticized by Washington. Third is localizing the supply chain, where Chinese companies establish factories or assembly plants in Mexico and using the USMCA agreement enjoy lower tariffs by labeling their products as North American made for export to the US. For example, some Chinese brands in furniture, textiles, and home appliances have quickly entered the US market through this method. Therefore, it can be said that Chinese products entering the US through Mexico are no longer just rumors, but a tangible trade reality, becoming the latest front in the ongoing US-China trade struggle. This has undoubtedly deepened concerns in Washington. Since this year, the Trump administration has continuously pressured Mexico to raise tariffs on Chinese imports to curb this phenomenon. For instance, the US has frequently warned Mexico, stating that if the country does not impose restrictions at the source, the US may increase tariffs directly at the border to prevent Chinese goods from entering via Mexico. Earlier, the media recorded that in mid-July, Trump hinted on social media that he was prepared to raise the overall tariff on Mexico to 30%, with the increase set to take effect as early as August 1st. But after a July 31st phone call between the US and Mexico, the Mexican side publicly stated that it had secured a 90-day freeze on tariff increases, allowing more time for trade negotiations. During this period, the US refrained from further raising tariffs on Mexico, and both sides intensified talks. Subsequently, Mexican officials introduced the concept of Fortress North America, aimed at limiting Chinese imports while strengthening trade and manufacturing cooperation among the US, Mexico, and Canada. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent welcomed this move, seeing it as a potential North American unity partnership and more likely as a unified front to counter China. Additionally, Mexico's decision to raise tariff also stems from the image crisis caused by the rampant counterfeit goods flooding the market. Mexico has seen a surge of low-priced Chinese goods and counterfeit products in recent years. For example, the counterfeit goods seized at the end of 2024, which were imported from China, have not only impacted Mexico's textile, toy, and small goods market, but have also deepened the negative perception of Made in China among both the government and public opinion. This has reinforced the consensus that higher tariffs are needed to protect the market. The presence of counterfeit goods have even provided the US with further justification to pressure Mexico to limit Chinese imports. Moreover, these counterfeit goods fuel the gray economy and smuggling networks, exacerbating Mexico's already severe issue with security and corruption. Media outlets have pointed out that the problem of counterfeit goods is not just a consumer-level issue, but a systemic risk that affects industries, taxes, employment, and even national reputation. Additionally, Mexico's decision to raise tariff is driven by its own economic challenges. In recent years, although Mexico has benefited from nearshore outsourcing in the global supply chain restructuring, attracting some multinational investments, the overall economic performance has been underwhelming. Manufacturing output growth has been weak, and local businesses face fierce competition from China's low-priced goods, particularly affecting traditional industries such as textiles, footwear, and plastic products. In 2024, Mexico's trade deficit with China neared a historic high, exceeding 100 billion, which has not only put pressure on the fiscal budget, but also sparked public concerns about local industries being squeezed. In other words, raising tariff is not only a foreign diplomatic stance, but also a domestic self-rescue measure to stabilize employment. At the same time, the Baum's administration is working to revive domestic industries through the Mexico Plan. The Mexico Plan is the government's core economic strategy aiming to transform Mexico into a new manufacturing hub for nearshore outsourcing. It focuses on three key areas. First, the construction and upgrading of industrial parks to attract production lines shifting from China and other Asian countries. Second, improving logistics, energy, and other infrastructure through public spending and investment while stabilizing employment. Third, implementing tariffs and industrial policies to create space for local businesses, preventing them from being squeezed out by China's low-priced goods. Thus, raising tariffs is not only a defensive protection measure, but also an active tool for attracting investment. By increasing the external cost of competition, it aims to lock more capital and orders within Mexico, particularly in industries such as automobiles, textiles, and home appliances. The government wants foreign investors to see a more controlled and policy-backed market environment, encouraging them to move production lines to Monterrey, Guadalajara, or northern border cities rather than simply using Mexico as a transit hub. In short, this is both an investment attraction plan and an industry protection tool, signaling a stance of North American integration to external partners while responding to the challenges faced by local manufacturing industries. But the private sector's response to this is mixed. On one hand, local manufacturers were cheering. On the other hand, businesses relying on Chinese supply chains are deeply concerned. Data shows that in 2024, Chinese exports accounted for 21% of Mexico's total imports, with a trade surplus of nearly 120 billion US dollars. This imbalance makes the Mexican economy resembled a tilted seesaw, with cheap imports on one side and local unemployment risk on the other. Expanding further, Mexico's tariff plan is not an isolated event, but part of the global wave of trade protectionism. Experts point out that the motives behind this move are far more complex than economic factors alone. It reveals the deeper logic behind the geopolitical competition between the East and the West. Take the US as an example. During the first Trump administration, a trade war was launched against China, imposing hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs. In 2025, Trump's second term escalated this further. Not only were tariffs on Chinese goods raised by 10 to 60%, but the scope was also extended to countries such as Mexico, Canada, and India. This move effectively drew investment back into the US, with foreign direct investment from China, Mexico, and Canada sharply declining in the first half of 2025, while domestic US investment surged. In October 2024, the EU passed a tariff decision on Chinese EV, imposing anti-subsidy tariffs ranging from 7.8% for Tesla to 35.3%. This move came after an EU investigation found that the surge in Chinese electric vehicle exports was driven by government subsidies, threatening local manufacturers. After EU member states approved the vote, while the market's shares of Chinese electric vehicles in Europe did not collapse, their growth slowed. Some media outlets argue that the broader significance of this is the global trend of deglobalization. Over the past 3 decades, China, by joining the WTO, became the world's factory, quickly integrating its vast labor force and low-cost manufacturing into the global supply chain. During this phase, China exchanged low tariffs for market access, cheap labor for orders, and a complete industrial chain for efficiency. As a result, the share of global manufacturing value added by China once exceeded 30%. Times have changed, and the world's factory aura that China once enjoyed is now overshadowed by the shadow of the de-Chinization. The US has progressively escalated its trade war and tech battle, citing national security and industrial competition as reasons. While Europe rhetorically emphasizes de-risking rather than decoupling, it has imposed restrictions in key sectors such as electric vehicles, photovoltaics, and rare earths. Multinational corporations are increasingly adopting the China Plus One strategy, shifting production capacity to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. Ironically, China, which once grew through protectionism and industrial subsidies, has now become the main target of global de-risking efforts. The irony is that before joining the WTO, China was a veteran of trade protectionism. For a long time, almost every key industry enjoyed high tariffs and market access barriers, from automobiles to telecommunications, from agriculture products to cultural content. Foreign companies wanting to enter the Chinese market were forced to either form joint ventures, transfer technology, or face import tariffs, often exceeding several dozens percentage points. It was precisely through this closing the door to focus on internal development model that China gradually built its own automotive industry, electronics sector, and e-commerce empire. But now, when Mexico, the US, and Europe starts to apply the same logic of setting limits, Beijing immediately cries unfair and against the spirit of free trade. This situation has left many online users calling it ironic.